After-action report detailing the final round of the Corndog Extravaganza between the 18th Moose Cavalry and Neurohelm buffering. The mission would be a straight fight between both teams, with the ultimate goal being the destruction of one side or the other, and failing that, the percentage of battle value remaining would determine the victor. However, with 25 rounds on the clock, one side failing to destroy the other was an unlikely outcome. Turn timers continued to be in effect to keep the match moving, 60 seconds for each movement, and 30 seconds for each shooting or physical. The 18th Moose Cavalry brought a team of primarily heavy armor brawlers to the match, with a Warhammer for backup. The Warhammer 6R would be piloted by Load in conjunction with the Hunchback 4G, both using veteran pilots. The Warhammer would provide fire support, with the PPCs able to apply pressure from afar and a close-range loadout strong enough to make entering the front arc with any light mech a risk. The 6R requires good heat management to pilot with its limited heat sinks, but maintaining a firing pattern with the PPCs would allow the mech to keep the heat levels down on approach. The Hunchback would present the more immediate threat of the two, as if it was allowed to close to range with its autocannon, the risk of opening up ammunition-loaded side torsos of the slow-moving Neurohelm Sults was high. Vendrette would bring two Axemans to the field, the 1N and 4D. As the original Helm-Tech version, the 1N carried an autocannon 20 and a trio of medium lasers for close-in fighting. A large pulse laser was mounted on the left arm for skirmish work. It also featured 4 jump jets for ease of maneuvering at close quarters. The 4D would drop the jump jets in order to fit 4 light autocannon 5s and 2 medium lasers on the design, giving it less maneuverability but better range. Both designs would feature the hatchet that gave the mech its name, and would be fully capable of removing an opposition mech's head with said hatchet in close quarters combat. Neurohelm considered the Axeman 1N the greatest danger of the 18th Moose's lance, as its armor would likely give it the ability to weather enough fire from Neurohelm to close in and open up a torso for the other mechs of the 18th Moose to exploit. Neurohelm prioritized armor and firepower for their lance, deciding speed to be less important when in a straight fight where the opponents were likely to come to them. They selected a lance of units intended to present the opposition with difficult decisions for target prioritization. Sacred brought an elite longbow 13C and a Spider 8M. While arguably more optimal to settle for a veteran pilot in the longbow in order to bring a more durable unit instead of the Spider, the elite pilot allowed for some capabilities that would be less reliable with a veteran pilot. First, it made it significantly more risky to close with the longbow with the lighter jump units that were likely to be prominent in the tournament, especially as the ability to arm flip the majority of the mech's firepower would make the rear arc less of a safe proposition. Second, it would provide a useful tool for applying long-range pressure to any clan large pulse lasers that would be trying to operate at long distance. Third, it would enable semi-reliable use of indirect fire from the longbow, which would allow Neurohelm to apply early damage and, if it came up, allow Neurohelm an avenue to overcome small battle value percentage advantages obtained by an opposing team should they decide to take advantage of Neurohelm's slow speed and try to retreat out of line of sight after establishing a lead. The Spider would be able to spot for this indirect fire, as well as harass in relative safety due to the difficulties involved in damaging it and its relatively low target priority. Lincoln brought an upscaled Annihilator 2A and a veteran Charger 1A1. Despite its slow speed, the Annihilator represented a counter to any tank units fielded with its LBX weaponry, and the medium pulse lasers would provide an answer to smaller jump pulse units. Slow speed would likely place the unit at the back of the lance, but this would enable it to cover the back of the longbow and would mean that the longbow could partially screen for it. The veteran Charger would provide the remainder of that screen, presenting a significant melee threat to any jump unit with its speed and tonnage, and a lower but still notable melee threat to any other unit. Piloting differentials between the skilled Charger and an opponent would make hitting charges with the Charger a high enough probability outcome to force opponents to maneuver cautiously. Incautious maneuvering would allow the longbow and Annihilator more time to expend their ammunition loads. More importantly, the choice for who to focus on in the Neurohelm force was not a clear one. The Annihilator would be an easy target given its inability to reliably generate any TMM, but despite being relatively low armor for a mech of its tonnage, it would still take a number of turns to break into any important components. And between 100 tons worth of internal structure, cased ammunition, and a standard fusion engine, the chances of killing this mech quickly were low. The Charger would be a threat that demanded attention due to its proximity to opponents and lower TMM, but again, despite lower armor, its standard engine, 80 tons worth of internal structure, and lack of any explosive components would make finishing off this mech a time-consuming endeavor, and every turn spent on it would mean a turn for the mechs with firepower to shoot unopposed. The Spider would also be difficult to deal with, though for a different reason. Piloted correctly, any shot made at it would be unlikely to hit, and once again, turns spent chasing a Spider would likely mean a higher value unit than the Spider being distracted from a fight that it should be helping with. The most obvious Neurohelm mech to focus on would be the Longbow, as it represented both the highest battle value of the Neurohelm lance and would be comparatively the most fragile of them, with its armor distribution making the side torsos full of ammunition and an XL engine more vulnerable. However, any single mech engaging the Longbow would be likely doing so at a loss due to the Longbow's elite skill and high firepower, making it difficult to trade up into, especially with no options to outrange it. On top of which, the Longbow still represented an assault mech with significant armor, so anything short of heavy Gauss or an AC-20 would be hard-pressed to wear through that much armor quickly. And again, any decision to focus on any one assault would give the other two assault mechs time to cause havoc. Neurohelm considered the best path of victory against their force would involve quickly committing units to destroying the Longbow and removing its ability to influence the arena. The longer it was on the field, the further behind an opponent was likely to fall in the damage race, and the harder it would be to commit units to killing it without losing them outright. The other mechs, the Charger and Spider especially, were deployed to distract and draw as much fire as possible from the Longbow, presenting more opportune targets as well as seemingly more imminent threats. And every turn spent attacking either mech or maneuvering around either mech was viewed as a benefit for Neurohelm. The arena for this match would be a hex map of 14 hexes per side constructed by PS359 of the MRC. The arena would be a snowfield surrounded by magma to make keeping one's back to the wall a risky endeavor, as being pushed into magma would result in the mech gaining 15 uncapped heat that turn, as well as taking 2d6 damage to each location exposed to the magma when it enters the hex, as well as the next turn it starts in the hex. The map would also feature a series of ridgelines running around the outskirts of the arena that could be used to block line of sight, provide partial cover, or gain elevation for long-ranged fire. Trees also featured on the map, concentrated primarily around the outskirts with a few on the ridgelines and one large stand in the center of the map. The central stand would give a decent defensive position for any mech who could seize it, while the concentration of trees outside the ridgeline would mean approaching along the outskirts of the arena would provide the best chance of maintaining cover, and the trees on the ridgeline would slightly advantage any force assaulting from the center, as though the ridgeline could provide effective partial cover, there was no way to also gain benefit from any trees on the ridges without giving up that partial cover or being mutually affected by the trees. Due to having a range advantage over the 18th Moose Cavalry, Neurohelm would be looking to exploit that strength by establishing early positions on the ridgelines to maintain line of sight with the 18th Moose mechs, while placing the Charger between Neurohelm's fire base and the 18th Moose's largest concentration of units. The Spider would be operating primarily in a harassing capacity, as the indirect fire was unlikely to come into play this match, and the 18th Moose didn't have any units capable of chasing the Spider, so it was unlikely that the light mech would be able to pull any opposition away from the fight. Neurohelm buffering won the right to select their angle of approach for the match, and chose to approach from the west, deploying their units in a group with the two slow assault mechs placed to quickly reach the ridgeline and set up in a position with partial cover from the Warhammer. The 18th Moose Cavalry divided their force in half, deploying the two AC-20 mechs where they could take advantage of the trees to the south to provide cover while closing the distance with the Neurohelm firebase as quick as possible. The Warhammer and Axeman Blaster were deployed to the northwest where they could choose to flank or drive up the middle at their discretion. Neurohelm were able to step up to the ridgeline on round 1, enabling them to gain vision on most of the arena as well as the elevation to prevent the 18th Moose from gaining easy partial cover. The Spider was sent up the middle with the goal of getting into a position to harass the Warhammer and prevent the 18th Moose from being able to easily use it as an initiative sink. The Charger would follow the Longbow, looking to place itself between the Longbow and the 18th Moose's two AC-20 mechs advancing along the southern approach, and slow them down as long as possible. The Warhammer was walked up to a position where it could trade fire with the Longbow, while Axeman Blaster circled north, presumably looking to flank the Neurohelm force and close into melee. The longbow and warhammer traded shots, while the Annihilator took a couple of pot shots at the Hunchback. The longbow was sent further south in round 2, giving itself better partial cover and gaining a better line of fire on Axeman Hops. The Charger continued moving south to meet Axeman Hops, who was taking cover near some trees. The Spider was positioned in the middle of the arena where it would be able to threaten most units looking to pass the ridge line. 18th Moose brought the Warhammer and Axeman Blaster closer, entering the middle of the map with the Warhammer and getting up on the ridge line with Axeman Blaster. The Annihilator held a position, turning it to set up for future reposition while maintaining partial cover against the Warhammer and Axeman Blaster. More fire was exchanged, but with most mechs still in their long-range brackets, no mech took notable damage. In round 3, the 18th Moose continued their advance, with Axeman Blaster flanking from the north and Axeman Hops jumping into the same ridgeline as the longbow. The longbow was pulled back to remove itself from easy firing range of the Axeman's AC-20 to be replaced by the Charger, who would give the Axeman something to shoot at while continuing to screen for the longbow. The Warhammer and Hunchback ran closer while the Annihilator stood still to give it the best chance to hit with its weaponry. The Spider was sent far behind the Warhammer to keep it from becoming an easy target this round. The 18th Moose took aim at the longbow and Charger, but the ranges involved resulted in no hits connecting with the target. Neurohelm chose to focus on the Hunchback to continue to wear it down and hopefully minimize the amount of time it would have at effective AC-20 range. This would pay off for Neurohelm better than expected, as a through armor critical would damage the gyro of the Hunchback, knocking it over and significantly reducing the chances this mech would be able to contribute to the fight. In crippling the gyro and the Hunchback, Neurohelm were able to shift priorities to the other units of the 18th Moose and take aim at Axeman Hops, who had the greatest mobility and most threatening weaponry. Due to losing initiative this round, Axeman Hops moved conservatively, jumping to the other side of the ridgeline to prevent the Charger from coming to melee with it instead of closing in with the longbow. The Warhammer was shifted to bring the Charger and longbow into sight while keeping the woods between it and the Annihilator, and the Spider ran around to get in physical range of the back of the Warhammer. Axeman Blaster continued to flank from the north, reaching the ridgeline that the Annihilator stood on. Once shooting commenced, Neurohelm focused nearly all their firepower at Axeman Hops, shaving off a notable amount of armor, but more importantly damaging the engine of the mech with a through armor critical. Axeman Hops and the Warhammer took aim at the Charger, who had a low TMM due to crossing the ridgeline, while Axeman Blaster took potshots at the Annihilator and the Hunchback aimed at the Spider. In the physical phase, the Spider attempted to punch the Warhammer and apply more damage to the rear armor of the mech, but was met with no success. An initiative victory in round 5 by the 18th Moose prevented Neurohelm from using the Charger to screen the longbow this round, so Neurohelm elected to go on the offensive with it, closing in with the Warhammer who had shifted to occupy the heavy woods at the center of the map. In response, the 18th Moose had Axeman Hops follow the assault mech, reaching melee range of the rear arc of the Charger. The 18th Moose focused most of their lance on damaging the Charger and in the process took its head off with a shot from Axeman Hops' AC-20. The longbow and Annihilator were able to focus their fire on the Axeman once more, blowing off the right limb of the mech and thus removing both the Axeman's axe and all of its medium lasers. Now that it was closing in from the north, Axeman Blaster was able to pepper the Annihilator with the full force of its weaponry. In the physical phase, the destruction of the Charger meant only the Spider was able to act, whiffing a kick at the Warhammer. With the Charger dead and no heavy unit left to screen for Neurohelm's assault mechs, both Axemans closed in with their opponents. Neither would be able to successfully reach physical range on their own this round, but due to Neurohelm winning initiative, the longbow took advantage of Axeman Hops' missing arm to step up to the top of the ridgeline, allowing it kicks on the Axeman in the physical phase as well as removing the partial cover the ridge would have granted it. The Spider ceased harassment of the Warhammer this round, changing to poke at the Hunchback instead. In shooting, Axeman Blaster and the Annihilator traded fire, with Axeman Blaster destroying one of the Annihilator's pulse lasers and damaging the engine, while the Annihilator managed some engine damage in return. Axeman Hops would take aim at the longbow, trying to land an AC-20 on it without success. Axeman Hops would not survive to the physical phase, as SRM fire from the longbow would destroy both the engine and the gyro of the mech. The damage to the engine of Axeman Blaster in the previous round put the mech in a very tough position. Because of the 2 engine hits it had received and the fact the mech mounted only 10 single heat sinks, in effect the unit was unable to sink any heat from its weaponry, leaving its maneuvering options severely limited and meaning that any future weapons fire would only continue to add to the mech's heat load. The only way to alleviate it would be to shut down the mech for a turn. tantamount to a suicide maneuver in the Axemen's current position. With few options left to it, Axeman Blaster spent all of its movement shifting into melee range of the Annihilator to try and get a good hit with its hatchet that would hopefully finish the Assault Mech off before the Annihilator's firepower overcame it. The Hunchback had opted to risk standing on its damaged gyro in the previous round, and the Longbow and Spider aimed to take advantage of that, focusing their fire on the hobbled mech. Concentrated firepower from both would knock it back over in the shooting phase, damaging the autocannon 20 in the fall and reducing the Hunchback's firepower to his 2 arm-mounted medium lasers. Axeman Blaster's luck was little better, failing to stay standing as well in the face of the Annihilator's firepower. The Warhammer would extract some small retribution, however, landing a PPC hit on the head of the Longbow and exposing the mech's internals in that location, making it vulnerable to a follow-up hit from any of the 18th Moose's weaponry. The Annihilator would continue to degrade Axeman Blaster's combat capability in the physical phase, destroying the unit's right arm with a kick and removing its hatchet from play. With the Hunchback now severely degraded, Neurohelm shifted focus back to the Warhammer, which had walked to close range with the Longbow to hopefully land a knockout blow with its short-range weaponry before the Longbow could take out its armor. Axeman Blaster stood back up and began dumping its autocannon ammunition this round to try and avoid an ammunition explosion and keep the mech alive a little longer. This maneuver would prove to be insufficient, as fire from the Annihilator would reach the right torso armor of Axeman Hops, and the resulting critical hits to the engine would take the unit out of action. The Warhammer would open up with most of its close-range weaponry and would successfully hit a through-armor critical on the engine of the Longbow, and the Longbow would return the favor with a full alpha strike, destroying about 4 tons of armor in conjunction with the Spider. The Warhammer and Longbow would exchange physical attacks this round, with the Warhammer damaging the upper leg of the Longbow and the Longbow significantly damaging the center torso of the Warhammer. The alpha strike plus the engine damage it received would force the Longbow to make a shutdown check in the heat phase, but it would successfully avoid it and remain a threat for round 9. The Hunchback would make one more attempt to stand this round, but would fail, falling on its head as a result and ultimately causing 2 pilot hits that would knock the pilot unconscious. This fall would make the medium mech an easy target for the Annihilator, who would end up touching off the remaining AC-20 ammunition and detonating the mech. The Warhammer would meet its end on its feet, firing nearly everything it had at the Longbow as the Longbow and Spider put another alpha strike into the 18th Moose's last mech. The close-range loadout of the Warhammer would not manage to finish off the Longbow, but 2 turns of pushing its heat would come due as it failed to prevent itself from shutting down in the heat phase, and the ammunition in the mech cooked off, blowing out the right torso of the mech and destroying the XL engine. The 18th Moose deployed their AC-20 units well, sending Axeman Hops and the Hunchback south as a group to challenge the Longbow. A gyro hit to one of them, and then reasonable caution kept the AC-20s from being able to be in short range for as many turns as they may have wanted, the Hunchback being neutralized so early and then an initiative loss making it risky to jump the Axeman close enough to get good shots on the Longbow in round 4. However, punching through quickly and relying on solid hits with the AC-20s to strip armor from the vital areas of Neurohelm's Keystone Mech was a good strategy. Notably, it still took Neurohelm 3 turns of fire to remove the Axeman as a threat. Not having to worry about backup from the Hunchback was a significant boon for Neurohelm. The Spider could have been utilized more effectively in rounds 3 to 5. Lining it up to harass the Warhammer would make the mech a riskier initiative sink, but focusing on gaining strong TMM on round 3 made it lose out on an opportunity to pressure the Warhammer as the Warhammer had moved before the Spider, which would have then gave the Spider an opportunity to put itself at short range with its medium pulse lasers into the rear of the Warhammer, at the cost of only 1 TMM. The trade-off would have been putting the Spider at greater risk of an AC-20 shot, but this arguably would have been a worthwhile risk, as the best the Hunchback could have managed in that scenario was a 10-up, and that would have additionally taken breaking off or stalling its approach towards the Longbow and Annihilator in order to make that happen, giving those 2 mechs more time to ramp up damage on both Axeman Hops and the Hunchback. The Charger's positioning in round 5 was made without considering Axeman Hops' willingness to follow. It was assumed that the Axeman would take advantage of the Charger's inability to threaten it this round to continue advancing on the Longbow and start trying to take it out of action. As a result, the Charger was positioned to avoid exposing its rear arc to the Hunchback via rotating the mech to face the northeast in the movement phase. However, if the possibility of the Axeman pursuing the Charger had been considered, then rotating the torso to face the northwest instead would have achieved the same effect, but forced the Axeman to move further away from the assault mechs if it wanted to place itself in the Charger's rear arc. This would potentially have bought Neurohelm Firebase a bit more time with their range brackets, and lowered the 18th Moose's ability to retaliate. The outcome of the charger would have been functionally unaffected. The head would have still been hit, the charger would not have been any harder to hit, and the axeman would still have been able to walk to get where it needed to go. But an assumption of the opponent's strategy caused Neurohelm to lose the opportunity to give themselves a small advantage, and small advantages are where you tilt the odds in your favor. 18th Moose was able to make good use of the hold down rules to avoid the consequences of their damaged gyro. Outlined on page 19 of Tactical Operations Advanced Rules, hold down's primary benefit is that it allows mechs to make greater use of partial cover, improving the defensive bonuses they get from it. However, a more obscure use of hold down is that a mech is permitted to go from a prone position to a hold down position without the need for a pilot roll, avoiding the penalty from firing prone at the expense of losing the defensive benefits of being prone. Though the Hunchback was unfortunately positioned to take advantage of this fully, it was able to get into a hold down position and consequently take shots and provide a threat radius against the Charger and Spider that a +2 from being prone would have severely diminished. At this juncture, I feel a thank you is warranted to Exemplis and all the other members of the Black Pants Legion Auxiliary for assembling, map-making, arbitrating, and hosting this tournament. Thank you in particular to Diggs, Silicon Soul, and Zero Paladin for acting as referees to Neurohelm's matches. Additionally, in no particular order, thank you to Vendrette, Load, Crimson, Cassitastrophe, Dapper Apples, Rathius Prime, Karnk, Cerulean, Gregoric, and Karanu for being excellent opponents. Here's to a third Corndog Extravaganza.